the family who left me to suffer, and the revenge they never saw coming. Mark never thought he would be the kind of person who'd hold a grudge, but life had a way of changing things. Raised with the belief that family always had each other's backs, he never imagined that his own relatives would turn their backs on him when he needed them most. At 32, Mark had been living a steady, successful life in Texas, working as a financial consultant and planning for his future. But everything came crashing down when he was diagnosed with a life-threatening illness. His doctors told him that he needed immediate treatment, and with no health insurance, he quickly found himself drowning in medical debt. What was supposed to be a routine checkup turned into months of hospital visits, costly procedures, and an overwhelming pile of bills. Desperate, Mark reached out to his family. His uncle, a successful business owner, his cousin, who boasted about her real estate investments, and even his parents, who were comfortably retired. He had always thought they would be there for him in times of need. But when he asked for a loan to cover his medical expenses, their response was always the same: "We have our own lives to deal with." Some family members ignored his pleas, others sent vague, dismissive texts, and a few even lectured him on financial responsibility before refusing to help. Meanwhile, they posted pictures of their luxurious vacations, their new cars, and their expensive shopping sprees. The same people who had money to spare, didn't even have the decency to help a family member in need. Mark was crushed, not just by the rejection, but by the stark realization that his family didn't see him as a priority. Yet, he refused to give up. He took up extra work when he was physically able, fought with hospitals over bills, and clawed his way out of the debt. It wasn't easy. There were days when he went to bed hungry, wondering if he'd ever make it, but somehow, he did. The anger he felt toward his family didn't fade. It only sharpened. Mark had learned the painful lesson that family wasn't always there when you needed them, and he vowed never to forget it. 2 years passed, and Mark had rebuilt his life on his own. It hadn't been easy, but he'd managed. Every day, he worked harder than the day before, picking up side jobs, teaching himself new skills, and learning how to make a living without depending on anyone. There were nights he wondered how he'd make it, days he thought he'd never escape the financial pit his family had left him in. But he kept pushing forward. He found remote work, started freelancing, and learned the ins and outs of financial management. Slowly but surely, Mark climbed out of the mess that had once seemed insurmountable. Every dollar he earned was a reminder of how far he'd come. But just when he thought he was done with them, the messages came. It started with a text from his cousin, Emily, the same one who had dismissed him when he'd asked for help. Her message was short and cold. "Hey, hope you're doing well. I really need your help with something. Can we talk?" Mark almost laughed aloud. A favor from her? After all this time? He hadn't spoken to her in months, and now she was reaching out. He sat back, staring at the message, a bitter laugh threatening to rise in his throat. This was the same cousin who had posted pictures of her luxury vacations while he was struggling just to make ends meet. Curiosity gnawed at him, so he decided to dig a little deeper. A quick social media search revealed it all. Emily had stretched herself thin buying properties she couldn't afford. The market downturn had hit hard, and now she was in financial trouble. But it wasn't just her. His uncle, the one who'd lectured him about standing on his own 2 feet, had filed for bankruptcy. Mark felt a cold, dark satisfaction spread through him. It was all falling apart for them. The same people who had refused to help him when he was drowning were now struggling to stay afloat. And they had the nerve to ask for his help. Mark didn't respond to Emily right away. He let her stew in her desperation. After all, He had earned his success on his own. It was time for them to learn what it meant to be in his shoes. 2 days passed before Mark received another call, but this time it wasn't from Emily. It was from his uncle, the one who had so easily dismissed him when he was at his lowest. The man who had ignored Mark's desperate plea for help now had the nerve to ask for his assistance. Mark stared at the phone, letting it ring for a few moments before answering. His voice was calm, controlled. "Hey uncle. It's been a while," he said. The silence on the other end stretched out longer than he expected, almost as if his uncle didn't know where to start. Finally, he spoke. "Yeah, it has," his uncle began, clearing his throat. "Listen, I won't waste your time. We're in a bit of a tough spot right now, and I was wondering if you'd be willing to help out." Mark's heart tightened, and a dark amusement flickered in his mind. So now they needed him. Mark let a pause hang in the air, forcing his uncle to feel the weight of his words. "Help out how?" Mark asked, keeping his tone light, casual, as if they were discussing the weather. His uncle hesitated before finally admitting, "Well, you've always been smart with money, and I know you've been doing well for yourself. We just need a little support to get back on our feet." A sharp edge settled in Mark's chest as he processed the words. "Support?" he repeated. "You mean after everything? After you turned your back on me? After I was struggling to survive? Now you want support?" Mark leaned back in his chair, feeling a cold satisfaction creeping over him. "Yeah, I'd love to help," Mark said, letting just a hint of amusement creep into his voice. "But you know, I have my own life to deal with." The silence on the other end was beautiful, pure. Mark could hear the realization sinking in, his own excuse thrown back in his uncle's face. Mark wasn't done yet, though. "Besides," Mark continued, "I wouldn't want to throw money away." The words hung in the air, just like the ones his uncle had said to him all those years ago. He let the tension build, savoring the moment. Finally, his uncle stammered, "I see how it is." And with that, Mark hung up. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Days passed after the call with his uncle, and Mark couldn't shake the feeling that his family was gearing up for their final push. He had made his point clear, but he knew they wouldn't stop. They were desperate, and desperation led to irrational decisions. That evening, as Mark was relaxing on his couch, trying to get back to his work, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was his mother. Mark let the phone ring, staring at it for a moment before answering, his voice steady, as if he had already anticipated what was coming. "Hey, Mom," he said coolly. His mother's voice came through, overly sweet, almost forced. "Sweetheart, it's been so long. We've been thinking about you. I saw your pictures. You look great, really. We're all so proud of you," she said, sounding like she was reading from a script. Mark's mind flashed back to when he had been struggling and his family had been nowhere to be found. There was no pride then, just judgment and silence. "Proud?" Mark repeated, his voice steady but edged with disbelief. "Where was that pride when I was lying in a hospital bed, drowning in medical debt, and all of you ignored me?" His words hung in the air, cutting through the false sweetness in his mother's tone. There was a long silence on the other end, and then his mother's voice softened, her vulnerability leaking through. "Well, things have been tough lately. You know how the economy is. Your father's investments took a hit, and we're just a little tight right now. I was wondering if you could help us out, just a little." Mark felt a small laugh escape him. "You want help? After everything? After all the times you turned your back on me, You want me to help now?" He took a deep breath, letting the weight of the situation settle in. His family, once so dismissive, now had the audacity to ask for his assistance. "I could give you the money," Mark said, his voice cold and calculating. "But you know what? I don't think I will." The silence on the other end was deafening. His mother sputtered, "What?" No, your family. We've been there for you." "No, you haven't," Mark interrupted sharply. "When I needed you, you weren't there. Now that you need something, I'm supposed to forget everything and bail you out? No, you're not getting anything from me." He hung up before she could reply, a sense of satisfaction washing over him. For the first time in his life, he was standing firm, letting them feel the sting of their own actions. Mark felt the adrenaline still buzzing in his veins as he hung up the phone. It had been a long time coming, but for the first time, he was in control. His family had no idea how much he had changed. The moments of desperation they had shown him had finally come full circle. He was no longer the vulnerable person they could easily manipulate or ignore. He had fought his way to where he was, and he wasn't about to let them tear that down. For the next couple of days, things were oddly quiet. Mark expected more calls, more desperate texts, but nothing came. His family was trying to figure out how to manage without him, and for a brief moment, Mark wondered if they had finally gotten the message. But deep down, he knew it wasn't over. He wasn't that naive. People like his uncle and mother didn't let go of their pride so easily. They would come back, more desperate than ever. Then, just as Mark was getting comfortable, the phone rang again. This time, it was his cousin, the one who had once sent him that dismissive message about how everyone had tough times. He stared at her name on the screen for a moment, feeling that bitter, familiar taste rise in his throat. The nerve of them. But he had been expecting this. He answered the call, his voice cold but calm. "What's up?" There was a noticeable pause on the other end. When she spoke, it was full of hesitation, something Mark hadn't heard from her before. "Mark, look, we know things were bad before. But things are different now. We're struggling. Please, we need help. You're the only one who can fix this." Mark felt a dark sense of satisfaction. This was the moment he had waited for. But it didn't feel like victory, it felt like validation. They were finally at his mercy, crawling to him when they had ignored him for so long. "You know," he said, letting the words linger, "it's funny how quickly things change, huh? The same people who told me I was too much of a burden to help are now begging me for help." He leaned back in his chair, savoring the silence on the other end. "Please, Mark, we really need you," his cousin pleaded, her voice almost cracking. "You know what?" Mark said slowly, "I'll help. But you need to understand one thing, you owe me now. And I mean really owe me. Not just with money, but with respect. From now on, you will treat me like family." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "And don't think I'll forget what happened." He could hear her breathing heavily on the other end, but she didn't argue. "Okay," she said weakly. Mark hung up the phone, feeling a rush of power surge through him. He had made them admit their weakness, and now, with their pride shattered, they would have to face the consequences of their actions. But for Mark, this wasn't just about money, it was about reclaiming his dignity. He had been underestimated for too long. But now, the tables had turned. The next time they called, he'd be ready. "What do you think about Mark's decision to stand his ground? Was he right to cut ties with his family after everything they put him through? Or should he have helped them despite the past?" Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective on this tough situation. Let's talk about family, forgiveness, and knowing when enough is enough. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this. Your opinions really matter here.